Greetings and welcome. If you haven't heard of Spotify for podcasters, it's the easiest way to create and publish your podcast. It's free. That's right. It's free to download. It has built-in tools that will allow you to record and edit your podcast from your cell phone or any smart device. Spotify for podcasters also distributes your podcast on virtually any platform that streams podcasts, like Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Apple and Google Podcasts, and much more. You can even monetize your podcast with no minimum listeners. It's your one-stop app for podcasting. Remember, it's free. Welcome to the Trigger Wanna Talk podcast, where we have uncensored conversations, we exchange information, and we provide a ton of resources for the listeners. We talk about all kinds of things. We discuss human and sex trafficking, domestic violence, sexual-based offenses. We cover true crime cases, and under those true crime cases that we cover, we always cover a missing person case. And 99% of those cases are melanated men, women, and children. It can be an abduction, a runaway, or a kidnapping. We just want to bring the same energy and media attention to those that are missing that we don't see in mainstream media. Today, we are going to be talking about two men who have been missing since the early 2000s, and their names are Felipe Santos and Terrence Williams. Felipe Santos and Terrence Williams. We got a special guest that's back in the building. Her name is Simone Nofel. She is our resident collaborator talking about Applied Epigenetics. And we already had a conversation with her talking about her story about ancestral and generational trauma. Today, we're going to focus on everything that you want to know about ancestral and generational trauma. We're calling it the Ancestral and Generational Trauma Tutorial. So this is part 2 that we're going to be showcasing for everybody because, you know, we like to educate people on things as well as be an advocate and raise awareness. Before we begin, as always, this is the Trigger Wanna Talk podcast, sponsored by Spotify, produced by Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. We are streaming on all platforms. You can watch these episodes on Spotify, the free version, or our YouTube channel, which is Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. If you're triggered at any point during this podcast and you need help immediately, please call 911 here in the United States. That will get you police, fire, EMS. You can ask specifically for EMS if it is a mental health issue. If you are in an area where they have crisis intervention trained police officers, you can ask for a CIT officer to respond to that particular call. You can be very specific, and we like when people call 911 and are very specific on what they're calling about. So those are your resources for an immediate help. If you don't have an immediate need, but you still need help, we provide the numbers and websites for the following: domestic violence, sexually based offenses. So we refer you to an organization called RAIN, Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. We have the numbers for trafficking. We also provide information for those that are dealing with substance abuse, whether it be drugs or alcohol. So we have the numbers and websites for Al-Anon. We have the number and website for Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And finally, 988. If you are suicidal or know of a suicidal situation, that number is toll free and it's available 24/7 here in the States. Since we have a worldwide audience, if you live in the UK and you need help, you can call 999. That's their version of 911. You can also call 112 or 143 if you are in parts of Europe like Switzerland. That being said, we want to welcome back Simone Nofel. She has a master's degree in education. She's an applied epigeneticist. We want to talk all things ancestral and generational trauma. First and foremost, how are you doing, Simone?
I am doing so well. Thank you. How are you doing, Larry?
I'm doing great. I just want to jump right into it because, you know, one of the things that I like that you have on your Instagram page, you have healing ancestral trauma. I want you to break down ancestral and generational trauma because this is the tutorial. So we're going to spend this hour talking about everything that you want to know about the two. The mic is yours.
Awesome. Okay, so I think the first thing that I want to make sure everybody is aware of is that there's an overarching term. So the term intergenerational trauma encompasses the ancestral component and the generational component. So sometimes those get separated, but I think for the purposes of today, it would be beneficial just to kind of have that broad umbrella term of intergenerational trauma. And what that really means is that on a physiological level, so deep into our DNA lies trauma. So that means that trauma from our ancestors hundreds of years ago can be passed down to us generation after generation. And so that means that not only do our parents and our grandparents affect who we are today, but also their grandparents and their great grandparents and so forth. And so we have the opportunity today to talk about this and then learn how to move past it. Because what I do and what I always preach and what I'm a huge advocate for is that what is our current reality is not permanent. So we have the ability to take responsibility over our lives, our health, and so forth, change our realities. So if there was a trauma that happened in your ancestral line, in your bloodline, that doesn't mean that it needs to affect you, that we can change things like our habits, the choices that we're making as far as what we're putting into our body, what we're putting into our ears and our eyes, the things that we're consuming on all levels to be able to break free from those patterns. So that's why I'm here and that's why I'm so passionate about this work is because it's about freedom. It's about breaking free from those cycles that keep us into boxes, that keep us sick or that keep us with these limiting beliefs. And once we can shake all of those or break free from the shackles, then we can optimize our lives in so many ways.
You know, when we think about trauma, we typically start from the beginning, from the roots. And since we cover things like ACEs and, adverse childhood experiences, and we're talking about generational and ancestral trauma, let's go back. When you think about ACEs, which is again adverse childhood experiences, how does that play a part from your research in ancestral and generational trauma?
Yes, I love that starting from the beginning because that's how we do break these cycles. Is we break it for ourselves and then it impacts our children and the generations to come. And so how this all gets woven together, in my opinion, it really starts with realizing that our own childhood experiences impact the way we relate to others. So the way we relate to our future relationships as we go into adulthood, and then our relationships with our children when we become parents. And so when we're not conscious of the things that happened in our own childhoods, it can be repeated. So a lot of times, like what the research shows is that for children who experience trauma, that there's usually two ways that things progress. So usually they either go completely opposite of what happened to them, or they repeat the pattern. And so we have these two common paths or avenues that people go down when they experience trauma. So this is actually shown really vividly in studies with twins. So there's a lot of studies that they do on twins to kind of show these things versus like nature versus nurture, right? And that's what we a lot of times talk about when we're talking about childhood, nature versus nurture. So for example, we have two twins, twin A and twin B. They go through the same childhood trauma, the same experiences, and maybe at the age of 17, 18, they leave the house. One twin could go to meet their partners, have a great marriage, have children, have a beautiful, harmonious household. And the other twin could go in and have a toxic relationship and repeat these patterns with their own children. And so really what we're asking here is like, what sets twin A and twin B apart? And that's where epigenetics comes in, and that's where trauma healing comes in. Some people are more emotionally resilient because of the things that they do in their life, the practices that they do, and others kind of fall victim and come into this cycle to repeat this with their children and their grandchildren and so forth. So really, the big thing here is when we're talking about our own childhood. So if you're an adult, you're listening to this, right? You're an adult. Taking the time to reflect on your own childhood and where the trauma started for you, and if you've actually dealt with it. Like, did you sweep it under the rug, or are you actually looking under it and seeing, okay, like how can I clean this up?
One of the things that we talk about when we're talking about generational and ancestral trauma is the fact that when we have these conversations, I like having not only going back to the beginning, I like the breakdown of these terms and the etymology of them. Explain epigenetics for us, because I know we talked about that in the first part. Uh, Explain epigenetics.
Yes. So the way I define epigenetics is how our lifestyle habits influence the way our genes are expressed. And the way I explain this is that our genes, what we're born with, and our natural blueprint, our original blueprint, we all have this coding. And each of the genes have what I like to refer to as a light switch. And so at any given time in your life, depending on what you choose to engage in, to eat, to listen to absorb, that light switch can get turned on and off. So the example that my go-to example is like diabetes, right? So if your grandmother had diabetes and then your mom had diabetes and you're like, oh, well, shit, now I have diabetes and, that's just is what it is. Well, that's not true. Like you have the agency to change that. And
Yes.
so that light switch can be turned off. And so it's really just about getting conscious of what we do and what we say and what we think, to be able to manipulate and control those light switches in our genetic coding.
When you thought about studying epigenetics, did you really think that you'd be focusing on ancestral and generational trauma, or what was your goal in studying epigenetics?
That's a good question. I definitely did not think that I would be on this path. My intention going into it was really just for my own self healing and like for just evolving my own health, from what it was to what it can be. And there's just a lot of terms and concepts within the curriculum that I had never discovered or never learned or never tapped into, and so it was really just about me. And then when I started realizing that, oh, like I'm not the only one who might not be aware of these things, then I'm like, okay, like I can actually help other people and guide them on their journeys. And then once I realized all my passions and I understood that I don't have to pick just one thing, I was like, okay, how can I weave in all my passions? And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is ecopsychology and how nature influences us and how we influence nature because we're all just one, like it's the same thing. And so I was like, okay, so how can this element of eco psychology and then this element of wellness and ancestral trauma, like how does it go together? So then I started researching what is called rewilding. And that's really the practice of getting back into our primal ways in the context of our modern society, but getting back to those primal ways in order to heal. And so I started looking at like how rewilding for mothers could impact the trajectory of families. Went down that path, and it's just like, wow, like this is just so amazing. And then for me, because I'm a Black woman, I noticed that a lot of the Black community are detached from getting outdoors, from being in the wild, and there's trauma. That's based in trauma. And when we were running through the woods hundreds of years ago, it's because we were being chased by dogs and being shot at. And so now it's like we don't go through the woods as much, and it's kind of humorous, but it's also like so real. And there are so many amazing communities and groups that are trying to get Black people outside and get in nature, but there's a huge, huge gap between our like white counterparts who they're when they're out in nature and the groups and organizations and clubs that they have, versus what we have, and even just our accessibility to that, right? So a lot of times, more often than not, non-melanated people are able to walk outside their homes and feel safe and be outside in nature versus where a lot of communities, for Black people, you don't go outside without kind of looking behind your shoulder, and so there's a lot of barriers there. And my role really is to knock down those barriers and create ways for more Black and brown people to get outside and experience those therapeutic benefits.
Eco psychology. What specifically, or excuse me, how specifically does that tie into ancestral and generational trauma?
This is a great question. So when I think of eco-psychology, what I'm really thinking about is the symbiotic nature of humans and the wild, and how we're not separate from it, that we are it, and that what we do as humans affects the earth, and how the earth is operating affects us. And so when we think about ancestral trauma and we think about the entire human race, we can really say that 99.99% of every single human's ancestors once had a really deep relationship with the earth. So this kind of goes back into like the practice of shamanism, or the practice of really being in touch with the plant life, the animal life, the fungi kingdom, all of it. And so when we talk about ancestral trauma, this is a huge link between the two, because just like, colonization, right, kind of wipes away a lot of earthly practices that were not of the religion of the colonizers. And so we were stripped away. One, we were stripped away from the land that was us, that was our heartbeat. So a lot of our ancestors, they were displaced. And the land that they called home, the land that they interacted with, that they ate from, that they nurtured, was no longer, accessible to them. They were displaced. And so that in itself is traumatic. And so that you can kind of go back to there and then come back to the recent and to now and say, okay, so why do we have this resistance to be outside? Or, some people are like, oh, I only go outside when the weather is okay. But that wasn't even an idea before. It was just like, we're always outside. It doesn't matter if it's raining or if it's cold. We adapt, and we kind of are flexible to how we are getting out there. And so all of these things, our disconnection is trauma based, because when the original disconnect happened, it was really extremely traumatic for our ancestors to be kicked out of their land. And so when we try to cultivate a better understanding of ecopsychology, we have to look there first, and then come to us today and say, okay, in this modern world, what can we do to connect again, to reconnect to our primal instincts, to reconnect to our roots, really.
You're an educator. I want you to tighten down that brim, because we're going to really deep dive into some uncomfortable and controversial topics. This is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, sponsored by Spotify, produced by Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. You can watch these interviews on Spotify, the free version, or our YouTube channel, which is Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. Our guest today, back again, is none other than Applied Epigeneticist Simone A. Nofel. She has a master in education. We're talking about ancestral and generational trauma tutorial. This is part 2 of our series that we're going to be covering these topics. We're just going to fucking dive into it.
Let's go.
And if you're triggered at any point, folks, and you need help immediately, call 911. And if you don't need immediate help, we got a ton of resources listed in the show notes that'll be available in this episode, as well as all our other episodes. All right, I'm ready. Systemic racism and critical race theory from an ancestral and generational trauma perspective, using your studies in your academia as it relates to those two. What say you?
So the first idea that I want to lay out is that when we're talking about systemic racism, we need to not only acknowledge the ancestral trauma for the Black American, but we also need to realize the ancestral trauma for the white American, that we can't just tackle one side, that they both need to be acknowledged. And so what I really mean by that is that being descendants of enslaved people, we hold trauma. Being descendants of the slave masters also holds trauma, especially if for the white American, they don't align with that belief system, or they don't align with the behaviors and the thought processes that their ancestors did have. And so when we think about systemic racism and we think about critical race theory, it's pretty interesting to me, because there's those two sides of it. And with systemic racism, this is my personal opinion, that it's almost impossible for that to be eradicated in the current systems. And so what I mean by that is, we can try to fight the system, we can try to vote different politicians in, change policies, but really, because again, the roots of systemic racism are so deep, that it's almost not worth fighting. to me, my opinion is that we ought to build new systems. So we don't have to, use our energy and blood fight this old system, but just create a new system and just shift our perspective into what we actually want to see instead of destroying what we don't want to see. And by doing that, innately, the masses, we will switch over to that new paradigm of living. And so when we think about critical race theory, especially when it's being taught to children, I really think it does a disservice, not only to Black Americans, but to white Americans also. And one side of that is this fear, right? This component of fear. And I'm a huge advocate for removing fear and not operating from fear. And so if we're teaching our Black children, these different things like, oh, the KKK still exists, and they're not, they're not wearing white hoodies anymore. They're actually in police uniforms and firefighter uniforms. Like that
Yes.
to me is an unnecessary thing because one, it's not a reality in every bureau. It's not a reality in every town and city. So it can't be a universal curriculum being taught. And so, yeah, and then on the other side of that, for white Americans, especially children, then we start talking about self-esteem, right, and confidence. And all of these things in critical race theory is divisive. And so I'm just opposed to anything that's divisive. And so I think there's just a better way to approach systemic racism. Again, it's not about fighting the system. I'm very I'm very conscious of where I put my energy. And I think it would be amazing for a lot of people to be conscious about that and realize that, we kind of are just like fighting and fighting. And we've been doing that for decades and we're not really getting anywhere. The systemic racism is still there, even
Right.
if they're teaching CRT in schools. And so it's like, how do we reallocate our energy to something that's actually going to build something beautiful that we do want to see or that we do want to be involved with? So I think that's what's coming to me right now for that.
I want to stay on that because when I think of CRT, I think about the 1619 project that was just a phenomenal book. And I think about the conversations that I have and have had with people, non-melanated folks as well as melanated folks. One of the things that I say to people is you don't have to be fearful, as you just said, it's the fear factor. You don't have to be fearful of having the discussion because some of the stuff I think it's just like when you talk about defund the police. Well, if you defund the police, if you just take that word or that phrase by itself, and some people say, well, we should just start over. Well, how does that work? Like, what's the plan? I'm always saying, okay, what's the plan? Because a lot of times people want to just dialogue, and I'm like, okay, that's fine, but what's the action plan? Well, what do you substitute it with? What is your thought of starting over? How does that look to you? Don't just come up with these buzzwords or phrases and stuff or whatever, and then you don't have anything else to add to the conversation. Defund the police to me means the money that's budgeted already for that department or those departments, take a higher percentage of it and put it towards mental health. Take a higher percentage of it, not in don't apply it to equipment because they got all the equipment. Now, there are some departments that may need more or better equipment. I'm not saying that. I'm saying take the money that you have allocated already in your budget and you can move more into different parts of your service because you serve the public. So when we're talking about critical race theory, one of the things that I also say is take out the words critical race theory. Let's just talk about history because that's basically all we're talking about. We're just talking about history. So if you're fearful of history, what's the old saying? Those that don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. That goes for everybody,
Mm,
all genders, like you said, white, black, or whatever ethnicity you are. We're all affected by systemic racism. If you are an Asian American, you may have some prejudices. You may have some things that you're fearful of when you see somebody like me or they see somebody like you, just because of some of the stereotypes and the stigmas and the taboos. If you're a white person, you may feel the same way. if you are from another country and you're not melanated, the things that are broadcast on the news. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I think it might have been you. Well, I had my hoodie on, and it
Yes,
had
yes, yes.
for life, and I said, you know what? If I'm sitting there with my hoodie on and I go outside and it's just a plain hoodie, I might be stereotyped. But if you see my EMS logo and it has paramedic on the back, I typically don't get stereotyped. I typically get people coming up to me, asking me questions and all this stuff. But if I go out and I got a plain hoodie on, because I have those, people kind of stay away from me. And I'm telling you, it's almost
Mm.
every single time. Sometimes I do it intentionally. Sometimes it's just, hey, I just threw that on or whatever. I'm just going to get some milk or whatever. The reason I bring it up is because we're talking about ancestral and generational trauma. Nobody wakes up saying, today is a great day to be traumatized. Today is such a great day to, be, marginalized. Today's a day to be man, it's no clouds out. It's not raining and shit. I can't wait for my intimate partner to abuse me, whatever gender. I can't wait for somebody to oppress me. I'm just looking forward to not getting this job that I'm applying for and putting my resume and my cover letter and all my CV and all this stuff together. I'm just looking forward to being denied access. As an applied epigeneticist, when you're talking about critical race theory, what would you say to other educators about teaching CRT?
Don't teach it? No. I think that, like you said, it's about history, right? And so, again, we're all human, so we all have this bias to what we talk. I'm talking to you right now. I hold a bias from my background, my conditioning, my programming, things that I've learned. And so, I think like really don't teach it, but like I know that's not also actually attainable for most teachers, right? So if you're in the education system, you get told what to teach, and I understand that you might not have flexibility or independence in what you do. However, I do think there's a way of teaching this to children without, one, eliciting fear, and then two, being kind of neutral. So it's really not a neutral curriculum. It really isn't. But there's a way to either prelude it, like you can preface it by saying, okay, this is what it is. This is what I'm needing to teach you. Remember X, Y, and Z as I'm teaching this. Because I think it's fair to say that the curriculum itself, the CRT curriculum itself, is divisive. And so if you are an educator and that is not what your heart is saying is true, then just know that and try to kind of accommodate how your heart is feeling. Obviously, you have to be mindful if you're looking for your job security and you don't want to get fired if you stray from the curriculum. However, I do think it's a conversation worth having with administration.
No, I'm agreeing with you. Yeah, you have
Mm,
to talk with your higher ups about these things because,
yeah.
like you said, the curriculum is already put in play for that school year, and so to go against the grain, as I call it, and you and I talked before about this. I had a history teacher who he and I, and this is back in the late '80s, we went back and forth because this is during the time where I was into Public Enemy and KRS One, so the consciousness of rap, that era. And so things that I wasn't being taught in school, I was learning from hip hop. I was learning from rap music. This is before uh, the NWAs of the world became prominent. So this was the late '80s rap. We're talking about like Poor Righteous Teachers and the Brand Nubians and different people like that, the Arabian Rakims. Even though they talked about wealth, they also talked about knowledge and science and mathematics in lyrics. And so for me, when I look at education now and I look at what our children are being taught, I'm like, why are we not getting more things like STEM education, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math? why are we not having these open conversations about history more than, learning about history as far as Black history in Black History Month? That's still the most that we see schools focusing on Blacks and how they contributed to world culture, world society, and different things like that. But even then, it's not, to me, it's just never enough. Because a lot of times when I talk to kids, when you ask them about history, the first thing that they say is slavery. My granddaughter, she just started a daycare program in South Florida. And one of the things that my daughter did was she got her enrolled in a program at this school where they don't have any Disney characters on the wall, no cartoon characters or anything like that. They focus on STEM. And so they partner with people like myself, people like yourself, scientists, clinicians, doctors, lawyers, mathematicians, engineers, all people in all walks of life when it comes to STEM or STEAM, because they throw the arts in there also. And so I love that she found this place because, again, kids can see Disney characters at home. They can see them when they're, pulling out their little iPads or their little tablets and different things like that. When they're at school, I want them to learn about things that are going to help them get employment, help them create their own employment opportunities. So you want to be your own boss, be your own boss. As I always say, never get attached to a building unless you own it or your name is on it, because you are an independent contractor. And it's nothing like having your own business. Education is important. Everybody's not going to go get a college degree. So this is where STEM comes into play, because there are a lot of jobs in STEM that don't require a college degree. It's great having one because nobody can take your education away from you. There are jobs in STEM and STEAM that not only don't require a degree, will give you, six-figure incomes. I'm a living example of that. I was paramedic and a firefighter. And so I was making six figures between both jobs just because of the certifications that I have still to this day, the license also, and all of those things. For you, when we're talking about systemic racism specifically, as it relates to ancestral and generational trauma, what are some of the things that you would say to a non-melanated audience on how you would like to start over, basically?
Mm. Ah, yeah. So I feel like the first thing that I would mention is, again, like I always go back to self-awareness, right? To start reflecting on what your individual thought process is on this topic, and then where does it come from? So when we can ask ourselves, okay, what is our belief system and where does it come from? Then we can start to unravel that, right? To unravel to see if that belief system is actually ours, or was it our parents? Was it our teachers? Was it our friends? Because we get all of this information from all these different angles, whether it's media or school or parental figures. And to be able to shed that and find what your own truth is, I think will help move us forward. Because that's what happens, right? Like racism in itself is a generational trait. So if kids aren't born racist, and so like if we hold that belief that somebody who looks different than you is lesser than, like start to ask yourself, like, where does that belief system come from, and is that actually your truth? And then get out there and experience life. Like go have a conversation with somebody who looks like me, and just start breaking down those walls between us, because again, all of this is built on divisiveness. Like to fight against each other means we're not going to fight against the system. To fight against each other means we're not going to find the different negativities or the bad sides of our policymakers. And so when we're focused on each other, we're less focused on them, and that's the bigger issue. So Yeah, I would just encourage everybody to just have more conversations and to not be afraid to have conversations. Like, what's the worst that can happen? And somebody just says, no, thank you, I don't want to talk to you. Okay, then you move on. So I think the more connection um, between people who are different, the unity that comes with that, I think is really healing.
This is the Trigger Want to Talk podcast, sponsored by Spotify, produced by Pending Consulting Solutions LLC. We're on all major platforms. If you want to watch these episodes, you can go to Spotify or our YouTube channel, Pending Consulting Solutions LLC. Our guest is the talented and educated epigeneticist Simone Nofel. She has a master's in education. I always tell people watch these episodes because I bring up graphics and I share my screen a lot of times because I want people to think of this as an educational podcast also. We don't just talk about trauma. We don't just trauma dump here. We provide all kind of information, including educational things. I pulled up your IG page. And you got a meme on here that says how quantum physics relates to applied epigenetics. Talk about that briefly, because that could be a whole conversation in and of itself. But again, this is a tutorial, so we're just giving people some cliff notes. If you want more information, I'll have Simone's information, her link tree. I already got it on the screen here. I'll have that posted in the show notes so you can get in touch with her, because she has a gang of stuff that's available on her link tree. Some of it is free. There's a good amount of it that's free. So, applied epigenetics and quantum physics. How does that relate to ancestral and generational trauma?
Oh, this is where I geek out. I love this, and it definitely could be a whole episode.
The mic is
So,
yours. You got 15 minutes.
okay, let's see. So I think the starting point is that we'll look at two things: the quantum physics and then the applied epigenetics. So with applied epigenetics, we're looking at our genes, right? So it's like these different layers. We start with our body, and then we have our tissues, our muscles, our cells. It gets broken down, broken down, broken down. And so applied epigenetics stops at this gene level versus where quantum physics goes even deeper, right? So we're going into the atoms, into the molecules. So we can think of like quantum physics in this science of quantum entanglement. When we're trying to get to that spot in our awareness, we have to first understand the physiological aspect of that. So if you're looking at an atom under a microscope and you're seeing the three molecules, the protons, the neutrons, and electrons, and you'll see them, they're all bouncing around. And within that, within what you can see, is actually 99.999% energy space, right? So you have those three molecules bouncing around, and everything else just looks like nothing, right? It's just space, but it's not nothing. It's energy. It's what in quantum physicists they call it the information field, the quantum field. So if everything is made up of atoms, us, this water bottle I'm holding, animals, plants, books, whatever it is, it's all made up of atoms. And so if we all are made up of atoms, and if atom is made up of 99.99% energy, then we're all really mostly energy beings. Everything is energy. And so when we think of quantum physics and this theory of quantum entanglement, it means that everything is one. Like everything came from. So if you think about like the controversial discussion of the Big Bang theory, right?
Yes.
I love that theory because it's really talking about we were all one, and then an explosion happened, this bang happened, and we all came from source. We all came from God. We all came from the universe. Whatever your belief system is, it can still be factored into quantum entanglement because it really shows the unification of everything in our universe, especially us as humans. And so when we're talking about quantum physics and quantum entanglement, when it has what it has to relate to ancestral and generational trauma, it really also shows us that our own traumas are influenced by others' traumas, even if they're not in our bloodline. So the trauma that the white American has from being descendants of slave owners is very linked to the traumas that Black Americans have as descendants of of enslaved people. And so it's just all about unity. It's all about connection. It's all about how our actions, our behaviors, our thoughts not only influence ourselves and our children and our bloodline, but literally everything. And so when we can kind of start operating from that notion that everything we do matters, everything we think matters, then our vibration, our frequencies are going to rise, are going to elevate. We're going to ascend per se, not to get so esoteric, but that's the reality of it. So when we're thinking about growth, we're thinking about transformation. You can think about that you're elevating, you're rising your frequency, you're optimizing your frequency. And so if you are looking at healing ancestral traumas, frequencies can go hand in hand with that. So everything that is energy, which is everything, has a frequency, and frequencies can be manipulated. So our frequencies as human beings are manipulated all the time, and there's frequencies everywhere. So like, what is frequencies? Like our phones have frequencies, sounds are frequencies. We're listening to radio, you're listening to me speak, you're absorbing a frequency right now. And so because we can manipulate this, and again, with the epigenetics piece, is that we have self-responsibility, we have control over our unique frequencies. And so that there's things in our lives that we can do to change our frequencies, like stepping outside, putting your bare feet in the grass, absorbing the sunlight. The sun is always emitting frequency. The moon is always emitting frequency. And so when we can become aligned with nature and we can do these different practices to change our frequencies, then we're also healing ourselves on a physical, emotional, mental, spiritual level. And what I really love about this post that you're seeing here, if you guys are watching this, you'll see that there's a device that I use and I work with that's called the Healy. And it has a lot to do with the work that I am continuing in ancestral and generational trauma. So I started off not working with frequencies. And then when I started weaving in frequency technology into my healing, it really amplified my progress because I was able to reveal to me what was going on an ancestral level in my subconscious. And so I think I'll kind of leave it there because I can deep dive further into that. But definitely, if you're interested in learning about frequency devices and how this can impact your wellness and your ancestral trauma, definitely reach out. You'll have my contact here below the episode, and maybe we'll get into it in part 3 as well.
I was just going to say, you read my mind. That's what part 3 is going to be about, because we always like to wrap up with healing. How do you overcome ancestral generational trauma? I know we talked about how you did it in part 1. This healing device, and on the screen here, it asks the question, what does it do? And the answer is it emits frequencies to enhance your body's self-healing abilities, bringing your cells back into homeostasis, which is the way the body regulates itself, keeps itself balanced, and your body, mind, spirit connection into coherence. It brings unwanted thought patterns and subconscious beliefs to the surface, and then assists in optimizing potentials while harmonizing related themes. And so, real quick, this Healy device, who developed it and where can people get it?
Yes, so you're talking about the creators. There's a lot of people involved. The main person, his name is Marcus, and he is a quantum physicist, and then he studied as a monk for, I think it's about a decade, about 10 years, in the mountains, on his spiritual journey. And then he came out of that practice and he realized that the things that he was learning in his studies of being a quantum physicist were doing a disservice to humanity, because this technology was only accessible in hospitals and clinics. And he was like, okay, to really reach the potential that frequencies have for the human race and for really the earth, it needs to be accessible to more people. So it needs to be able to be a personal wearable device, and then it could be in the homes of millions of people. And so that's what he was coming from. He's and what I like to think of the Healy device in this is a bridge between science and spirituality. And it's so seamless of a bridge, so effortless. There's no bumps and roadblocks on this bridge. And it just kind of unifies these two different, but also very similar fields of study. And so if you're looking at getting your hands on a Healy device, definitely reach out. I'm also a distributor, so I sell them as well. And then I also help you on your journey to getting to know it, understanding how to use it, or if you're a practitioner, clinician, a coach of any sort, I'll also help you on how to not only guide, work with it for yourself, but also for your clients.
We're going to have a great conversation in part 3 because I see this device being so impactful and instrumental with professionals like first responders, with other clinicians, with other professionals like teachers and educators. And really, what you're saying is everybody can benefit from this device because we all have traumas. We all have ACEs. We all have some ancestral generational shit that we are dealing with or are not dealing with. And so
Mm.
when I think of the work that you're doing, this is why I wanted to have you back on the program, on the podcast, because sometimes people look at the science and they say, I'm not a scientist. You talk about quantum physics, you might as well be speaking in a whole nother language or what have you. And we're not saying that you have to get a postdoctoral degree in quantum physics to understand how quantum physics relates to ancestral and generational trauma. For you, what is another thing that you would say to non-clinicians, non-scientists, people who may say, you know what, I'm not trying to learn all of this stuff or whatever that you're talking about, but I'm interested. How can they get this information in a more simplistic but thorough form?
Yeah, so I have loads of resources, like short 12-minute YouTube videos that highlight just a very general summary of the science behind the Healy, but also just working with a practitioner or clinician. So I actually offer one-on-one frequency therapy sessions. So it's a 45-minute session where I actually am able to use the Healy in a distance. So all my clients right now are virtual. And so I've used this in a virtual capacity and then of course with my friends and family in person, but the therapeutic benefits that you can receive from the Healy aren't limited to just being in person. So you can, right on there, hop onto my website, www.heartyandfree.com, and that's HEART and free.com. And you can see my frequency therapy sessions. And so it's a 45-minute session where the Healy device will be able to scan your bioenergetic field and then show you what areas in your life, your body, mind, spirit, in your life, which areas need support. And so we can do that. And I can also, interpret the report for you and then send you the exact unique frequencies that you need in that moment. And I think that's the most powerful thing about these devices is that with the scanning feature, you're able to get the frequencies that you need in real time for exactly what you need in that particular moment in time.
I want to have you talk about these two questions that you have on your fact sheet. Um, you asked what is holistic health and wellness, and what's the difference between health coaching, life coaching, and traditional therapy. Can you speak on that for those that aren't watching the podcast episode?
Yeah, definitely. So the first question of what is holistic health and wellness? And what sets that apart from Western medicine really is that we see an individual in its wholeness, in its entirety. So if you think of Western medicine, right? If you go to a specialist, that's what they are. They're a specialist in one area of the human experience. And oftentimes different specialists aren't necessarily working together in collaboration. So you can go to a neurologist and be like, okay, this is going on with me. And then you go see a neurologist, but then they send you to an orthopedic person, okay, and it's not really connected. But really with holistic health and wellness, we're seeing that a human is all of it. So our emotions can manifest into physical conditions. Our physical conditions can tell us something that's going on inside. And so when we look at it from that perspective, we're able to get to the root cause of the issue instead of just looking for bandages. We're not looking for bandages to place onto people. We're looking at actual recovery and wellness at the core. And so why I really love holistic health and wellness is because when you start engaging in these different practices, even if it's something that seems like a physical practice, it's always going to affect your emotional body and your spiritual wellness too, because everything is connected. And so when you're working with a practitioner or a naturopath doctor, that's going to be your experience. Your whole being is going to be served. Your whole being in all of its essences will be optimized when you're working with holistic health and wellness. And then the second part of that was like the differences, right? So I kind of already highlighted the differences between holistic health and Western medicine. But when we go specifically into therapy, we're talking about the difference between traditional therapy and then working with like a health or life coach. The main difference is that when you're working with a life and health coach, for the most part, they're going to be able to support you in ways that traditional therapists might not be able to, because of they can't go beyond what the textbook says, or they can't go beyond that red tape that, you know, policies and government officials have put into place. And so the reason why I moved away from that, I was in the traditional health field for 7 years, and then I transitioned into the holistic world because I realized that the clients that I was serving weren't actually getting everything that they could get out of me. And I couldn't really speak from my heart. I couldn't give them the different recommendations that I knew could help them, because my board, the governing board above me, would say I would lose my license if I did that. And
Okay.
so, for example, So, for example, I was working with the autism population, from clients from 2 to 22 years old. And there'd be often times where I'd be like, okay, actually, you know, the environment in this household needs to change in order for these behaviors to go away. But I couldn't say that. Like, I knew that in my heart, but I couldn't really say that so directly. Kind of had to tiptoe around. And now I'm able to like just fully express myself. And, you know, not everybody is going to want to work with me. Not everybody's going to like that directness, and not everybody's going to be able to receive that. But I do know that my heart feels better. I feel more aligned in the work that I'm doing now, that I can fully give to my clients and let them know everything, all the resources that could be there for them, instead of just what's in one textbook. So,
One last question. Since we're talking about ancestral and generational trauma, the tutorial, this is part 2. I want to broach the subject about reparations, because we know
mm,
in this climate and in this country that reparations is moving up the charts, especially on the political spectrum. We know cities like San Francisco are coming up with a plan where all the residents that are melanated, um, and I don't know how specific they're going to get, because we might talk about that too. Maybe we'll talk about that more in part 3. But I do want to broach the subject. So San Francisco, my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, they got a committee that the Mayor Tashara Jones, who's the first African American female mayor of the city of St. Louis, she has a committee that she has started to talk about and do research on the reparations issue. And there are other cities across the U.S. that are talking about it. As an epigeneticist, how do you view the conversation about reparations and ancestral and generational trauma?
I think it's interesting. And I think for me, when it comes to reparations and how it's linked to ancestral and generational trauma, I think it's like a bonus, right? So, like, a bonus meaning that regardless, with or without those reparations, whether it's money or land, there's still going to be healing needed, right? Like, money doesn't solve your issues, land won't solve your issues, but it is a bonus. It can help. It can help get you access to the healing or to the services that you need. And so that's where I think it's really awesome. And then again, there's also a side of it where not everybody who will receive that money will actually use it in a way where it actually will serve them for their highest good. And so again, that's just self-responsibility. And, people can receive money and then throw it away. People can receive money and then invest in themselves and in their health. And that's awesome too. So there's so many nuances with that, but overall, I think, it's a good step in the right direction.
I'm not going to get into the 27 parts because my mind is mapping so much right now. I want to save that for part 3 because I really want to have a discussion about this is part of the resolutions, I would say, when we're talking about ancestral and generational trauma. How do you heal from that? So we're going to talk more about the reparations concept and the ideas and I have a few more specific questions, but we're at the top of the hour now. Simone, I want to air this podcast tomorrow. We do one every Thursday. So today is Wednesday, April the 12th. Tomorrow, our new episode will be this particular one. And we're going to just have some more great conversations about ancestral and generational trauma because this affects everybody, folks. And we don't sugarcoat shit. We're not attacking anybody. We're just having some open, honest conversations. This is not about bias. This is about how do we attack. If we're going to attack something, we're going to attack the problems. We're going to attack the systemic racism. We're going to attack the educational component of it, the digital divide. I want to talk about that more in part 3 because that's still a huge deal. We're going to talk about these resolutions and how do we obtain them, minimizing the trauma that we all have experienced. So that'll be in our part 3. I want to thank you, Simone, for joining us again for the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. Again, folks, I got all of Simone's information available in the show notes that we publish tomorrow, April 13th. Which is a big day for me and Mrs. LP because we're getting ready to close on our house tomorrow also. So I love the fact that we are dealing with ancestral and generational trauma. We always wanted a piece of the American pie. She's had a house before. I had a house before. And when we got together in 2017, 2 years later when we got married, or right before we got married in 2019, we were leasing this house back in St. Louis. And this was before the pandemic hit and we relocated here to Charlotte. So tomorrow's going to be a great day. I thank you so much for all the knowledge that you always kick to us. Love to you and the guys at home. I can't wait to see more videos on the
the Ways of the Wildling.
Ways of the Wild.
Our family adventure page.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I want to post your link tree. I have it on the screen right now. She has so many things. She's a moderator in a room called Kids EQ and Growth Mindset. When does that air?
That's every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
Every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. And she has a newsletter. There's so much stuff that she has on her link tree, folks. You got to check it out. She got stuff for kids. She got stuff on foods. She has freebies, which are some activities for some kids or what have you, and information on the Healy device. I want to thank you again, Simone. We'll talk later on and we'll come up with the date that we're going to shoot part 3. But that's it, folks. This is how we talk and deal with ancestral and generational trauma. This was a nice brief tutorial, a lot of information in a concise manner. If you want to know more, contact Simone. She's available, So thank you again. I want to jump into part 3. You're so welcome, my friend. We got this scientific paper we're getting ready to write. Man, I'm so excited about that. Y'all got to stay tuned for that because that's going to be the bomb. Like I said, I know you got to run. I'm going to jump into our last portion, which is our missing person case. I will talk to you and see you in these clubhouse streets.
Okay. Congratulations. Tomorrow is so exciting. Take care.
Thank you. See, I got you out before your heart stops. See? All right, folks. We are going to be covering the disappearance of Felipe Santos and Terrence Williams. Now, Tyler Perry got involved in this. He produced a documentary on the disappearance of these two men. I got this case from none other than my beloved Mrs. LP. She was like, man, you got to look at this case. So I want to play the video here and let you all listen to it and see what.
A new docuseries takes a deep dive into unsolved missing person cases. The first episode of Never Seen Again highlights Terrence Williams from Florida. He was last seen getting into a sheriff's deputy's cruiser in 2004. That deputy was fired for lying about his interaction with Williams, but has never been charged. And now Williams' family is getting help in their fight for answers from filmmaker Tyler Perry.
I just wish people would take a moment and just imagine somebody you love disappears, just ripped away from you with no answers. I came across this story and I was shocked and outraged. I immediately thought, what can I do to help?
Terrence said that he was on his way to a party.
The next day came, I hadn't heard from him. I was in pieces because I knew something was wrong. My family back home called around every place that they could think of. They started calling the tow companies. They found that the car was picked up at the Naples Memorial Garden Cemetery. I went to the cemetery and I spoke with the workers there. And they told me that a cop put him in the back of his cruiser and drove away with him.
And by the accounts of the people that worked at the cemetery, they claimed that Deputy Stephen Calkins put him in the back of the car.
Dispatchers called Deputy Calkins to ask if he remembered towing Terrence Williams' vehicle.
Hello? Steve? Yeah? You towed a car Monday, a Cadillac, do you remember it? No.
As time went on, he came up with more specific details.
On January 12, 2004, while on patrol, this officer observed an older model, white Cadillac.
The deputy said that Terrence was having some sort of car trouble.
I yelled to the driver if he was having trouble, and he said yes. And he asked me if I could please give him a ride.
And then you start to question, what the hell happened after Calkins put this guy in his car?
I received a phone call from the Mexican consulate. And I'm going, oh my God, they found my baby, they found my baby. They were calling me to let me know that there was a young man, Felipe Santos, missing. He disappeared 3 months before Terrence disappeared.
And the last person that he was with was the same Deputy Stephen Calkins.
I remember just having a chill go down my spine because it didn't really even seem real that these two young men had gone missing in the same way.
If this is a coincidence and he is the most unlucky man in the world.
Why are you pushing me so hard?
Because there's a mother who wants to know her child.
Well, I understand. It's also 17 years later. I'm trying to remember as much as I can here.
I don't feel like I have the bandwidth to fight for anybody else until I get answers for Marcia and the Santos family.
And Tyler Perry is here with us now to talk about it. He is the executive producer of the premiere episodes of Never Seen Again, which you can stream now on our streaming service, Paramount+. Tyler, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you didn't know Terrence Williams before he disappeared, but you've since gotten involved in the case, and you worked on this docuseries, and you even spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of your own money and hired attorney Ben Crump to represent the Williams family. Why did you do all that?
You know, I was watching a television show, flipping through channels, and I came across this story a few years ago, and it just blew my mind. And the thing that made me get involved right away is this is first of all, the pure injustice in this, but also looking at his mother, looking at Marcia's eyes, looking at her pain, looking at her lack of hope. I just felt like, you know, I have a bit of a platform, I have a bit of a name. Let me see what I can do to help you. So I'm really glad that we were able to do this, and it's going to be on Paramount Plus for everybody to see it. I want people to really, really pay attention to this, because if this doesn't outrage you, I don't know what will.
Yeah, in fact, his mother really shared a lot with you, and she read a letter to the editor that she had written. I want to play that for everyone to hear.
We miss him terribly. Please answer a heartbroken mother's plea.
You know what kind of got me about the first two episodes, Tyler, is how ordinary of a day it was. How sort of blasé everyone is acting, with the exception of the families, about what has happened here. And you have one man, and when people watch the series, they'll see that there are other men too that have disappeared without a trace. It is outrageous. And everyone who can do anything about it is acting like it happens every day, acting like it's ordinary.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it is ordinary for a lot of people. This happens every day. However, if you have one person who puts this two people in a car, says that he drops them off at the same location, he's a deputy that's sworn to protect and to serve, and both those men disappear. There's no evidence from the convenience stores that he dropped them off. The people who worked in the convenience stores never saw him drop these men off, and yet he walks around free. He never faces any charges. He's never brought to justice for it. It's something insane that takes me back to Emmett Till being pulled out of the bed at 14 years old, and his parents, his mother Mamie, looking for him, wondering where he is. Here we are in 2004 when this happened, and it's still the exact same situation.
Yeah, Tyler and Anne-Marie has heard me talk about this. When I was a journalism student, I did a story on the 40th anniversary of the Central Park jogger, but I focused on the number of women who were brutally assaulted and raped the same week that Trisha Miley was. There were 5 women of color in New York City who suffered, in some cases, worse injuries than the Central Park jogger. And there was nary a tiny bit of coverage about these individuals. And I titled the piece, "Do You Know Their Names?" And that's what I thought of when I watched this series, Tyler. I had never heard of Terrence Williams before. I know Natalie Holloway. I know John Benet Ramsey. I don't know Terrence Williams. Why do you think that is in your estimation?
Well, unfortunately, I remember talking to a very prominent journalist, and I first went to him a few years ago and I asked, can you help me get some attention here? And he said, your victims aren't sympathetic, which meant Felipe Santos is a Mexican immigrant, undocumented, and Terrence had child support issues, being a young man trying to grow up and take care of his kids. So he had arrest issues around his child support. So that made them not sympathetic. Unfortunately, a lot of times in this country, if you're not blue-eyed and blonde, then your story or you disappearing, it does not get the attention at all. And to think that these men's lives had no value because of circumstances beyond their control, it breaks my heart. It devastates me because I could have been Terrence. I grew up in New Orleans with nothing. I dealt with police often. That could have been me. So Marcia could have been my mother. So that's where the fight is. But I completely understand what you're saying, Vlad. I get it 100%.
So where do things stand with the case now?
Where it stands right now is absolutely nowhere. It stands nowhere. Nothing's been done, and he's still free. He's living his life in Iowa, and for the last 17 years or so. It is my hope that the reason I had Marcia do the civil lawsuit is because I was hoping that we could have gotten a deposition and got evidence to actually have him charged. So my hope now is that the Justice Department, because nothing was done in Collier County, nothing was done this is in Florida, nothing was done at this at the attorney general's level in Florida, and nothing has been done anywhere else. So I'm hoping that the Attorney General of the United States Civil Rights Division will pick up this case and at least take a look at it.
Well, Tyler Perry, it is really a riveting and heartbreaking story. And you sort of repeat over and over, can you believe that this is happening at this time? And that's what I kept on thinking. Where's a surveillance video? Where's, we think of ourselves as sort of easily trackable in these days. And here's an example of how we cannot be. Thank you so much.
It's absolutely my pleasure for being here. Thank you for helping me with this. I appreciate it.
So you can check out the first season of Never Seen Again starting today on our streaming service, Paramount+.
That was the episode about Felipe Santos, and that was the episode that aired with Tyler Perry and attorney Ben Crump talking about the disappearance of Felipe Santos and Terrence Williams. Tyler Perry produced a documentary about these two young men. I will find the link and post that in the information section of the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. I want to thank again Simone Nofel for joining us, and we're going to do part 3 very soon. As always, in closing, thank you for joining the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. Again, we're sponsored by Spotify now because they bought out Anchor. and we're produced by Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. Streaming on all major platforms. You can watch this on Spotify and our YouTube channel. Also, Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. In closing, live in awareness, never live in fear. Keep your head on the swivel. Always, always, always think about being an immediate responder, because like my work partner Dot says, we want you to be a by-doer instead of being a bystander. It's not a matter of if, but when and where an active violent incident or an emergency is going to happen. And what are you going to do if you get caught up in this situation? Be it at a house of worship, a place of academia, a workplace, anywhere you are. You could be at the grocery store. You can be out at a nightclub. We want to teach you first aid, CPR, AED usage, stop the bleed, and there's many other things that we train people on. Active shooter, hostile events, all of those things. So keep your head on the swivel. Situational awareness is important. And always, always, always know that you have a voice, use it. For the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, LP out.